I started as a lower elementary guide and did that for many years before stepping into an admin role. Remember some of you from my days as a director of admissions. And a move took my family to Florida a few years ago, but I wasn't willing to leave my Greenspring family. So they have found me work to do over the years, and I've been able to stay connected to my favorite place. So can't wait to come visit again as soon as COVID allows it. And I'm really excited to be giving this presentation this morning. It's something I'm really passionate about. And because it's a nice small group this morning, I hope that everyone will just chime in with questions, comments, examples. We will be doing 2 breakout sort of practice sessions with different aspects of this model. There are also some videos that I'll be playing if my internet cooperates. So far so good, but we'll see if I can keep a strong enough connection. But I am really excited to share this with all of you and start the conversation. So we did our introductions, and I want to talk a little bit about the 3 things we'll be discussing today. So the CPS model, CPS stands for Collaborative Problem Solving, was an approach developed by Dr. Ross Greene. And I first discovered his work a couple of years ago as a parent when I was looking for help with my daughter's challenging behaviors. And what I found is that even though this is an excellent technique to use with children who are exhibiting challenging behaviors, it's also just a great method to teach problem solving, period, to all kids. And in fact, Dr. Greene himself wishes that he hadn't titled his first book, The Explosive Child, because he felt it may have sort of misled some parents into thinking that this was a technique just for children with very extreme behaviors. And in fact, he wrote a second book called Raising Human Beings, which is essentially presenting the same techniques, but for parents of children who are not having extreme behavior challenges, but just wish to have a beautiful collaborative method to employ in the home. And in fact, Greenspring has been embracing this, and we are being trained as an entire faculty and staff on this model so that it's something we can implement more fully in our classrooms. So we'll sort of 3 chunks to our talk today. First, Dr. Greene is going to ask us to change our lenses and the way we view children's behavior. Then we're going to talk about how to identify lagging skills and unsolved problems. And then the third, which is really the heart of what we're talking about today, is how to teach those skills and solve those problems. So that's a rough outline of where we're headed. So our first step is to kind of change our lenses, and I think it will help if we have a specific example or 2 in mind. So I'd like you each to take a moment. If you have a Post-it, you can jot it down or just have in your head a challenge that you're having with your child at home, whether it's a challenging behavior or just something you'd like to see go a little bit differently. Just take a moment to reflect on something of specific example with your own child that we might be able to apply the strategy to later on down the road. I'm going to give you a moment. All right, let's keep going. And if you didn't think of an example yet, something will occur to you as we go along. If you're like me, you probably thought of 100. And so keep that tucked away. So first, we're going to look at common beliefs about why children exhibit challenging behavior. these are the common cliches that kids are attention-seeking, manipulative, coercive, unmotivated, and limit testing. And some of the cliches about parents of these children are that they're passive, permissive, inconsistent, non-contingent, and that explains the children's difficulties. But luckily, thanks to an enormous amount of research that's been done over the past 50 years, we've learned a lot more about children with challenging behavior. And we've learned that the behavior modification strategies we've been using are often counterproductive and ineffective. So that's why I'm asking you to sort of look at challenging behavior through a different lens today. And we're going to develop a more accurate and compassionate understanding of challenging behavior, which will lay a foundation for what comes next. So Dr. Greene asks us to embrace what might seem to some a radical different take on things. Here's the crux of it. So he says kids do well if they can, not if they want to, but if they can. And just a note here, throughout these videos, you will hear Dr. Greene refer to children as kids. At Greenspring, we call children or students instead of kids. So I have changed the terminology in my slides from here on in, but you will hear him make that reference. So I'd like to let you hear Dr. Greene talk about this idea for a moment.
I think if you're working with kids in general, but challenging kids in particular, you need a philosophy. Who is this kid? What's he about? What's he up to? If he's up to anything, because you see, your philosophy is going to guide your actions, especially when the going gets tough. No philosophy, no guide. The most important theme of collaborative problem solving is this one: kids do well if they can. Now, nobody ever falls off their chair at the sight of kids do well if they can. It's only an earth-shattering philosophy if you consider a much more popular alternative philosophy that floats around out there called kids do well if they wanna. Now, kids do well if they can, and kids do well if they wanna are two completely different philosophies. And they have completely different ramifications for what you're gonna do to or with this kid to make things better. Let's think about kids do well if they wanna for a second. If you've got a kids do well if they want a mentality and you're working with a kid who's not doing well, then the reason you think he's not doing well by virtue of your philosophy is because he doesn't wanna. I've been thinking about kids do well if they wanna for a long time, and here's the conclusion I've come up with about kids do well if they wanna. It's wrong. Flat out, dead wrong. I ask myself, why would any kid not want to do well? Don't all of us do the best we can in the circumstances we find ourselves in? Well, the kids do well if they want a mentality has those questions covered with concepts like secondary gain, attention seeking, unmotivated, coercive, limit testing. We're going to have those babies put to bed by around 11 a.m. this morning. When you really think about them, they don't make much sense. When you really put them to the test, they don't make a great deal of sense. But let's say they do make sense. Even if kids do well if they wanna is right, and now you know I think it's wrong, it's narrow, because you see, it greatly narrows the role that you can play in the life of a kid who's not doing well. Because if you think a kid isn't doing well because he doesn't wanna, I can only think of one thing for you to do, only one role for you to play in the life of this kid: make him wanna. And we have the technology for making kids wanna. How do you make a kid wanna? You reward the behaviors you like and you punish the behaviors you don't. You give him the incentive to do well based on the belief that he didn't have the incentive to do well in the first place. And you are now in the business of making kids wanna. I sure do hope you're right about why he's not doing well. Because if you're wrong, and you're busy making a kid wanna, and he already does wanna, you run the risk of making things worse, or at the very least, not being as helpful as you might have wanted to be. I'm a kids do well if they can guy. I think if this kid could do well, he would do well. Something must be getting in his way. Your role just changed. Your role just changed. You've just flipped from thinking the kid isn't doing well because he doesn't wanna, and therefore thinking that your role in the life of this kid is to make him wanna, to something a lot harder, and in my experience, a lot more productive. You've just shifted to kids do well if they can, and what's your main role now? Figure out what's getting in his way, and you can help him. You can't help what's getting in his way. Biggest favor you can do a challenging kid is to finally, at long last, be the person who figures out what's getting in his way. Because you see, if he's still challenging, pretty surefire bet, nobody's figured it out yet. The key theme of collaborative problem solving, the key philosophy, if you remember nothing else from everything I say, I hope remember that if this kid could do well, he would do well, because kids do well if they can. I think if you're working with kids.
There we go. So it's important to accept, or at least be open-minded to, this basic premise as we move forward, because our explanation for challenging behavior guides our intervention. And as Dr. Greene said, if we think that a child is exhibiting behavior because they lack motivation or they're limit testing, then we're going to respond very differently with maybe more traditional methods of rewards and punishments. If, however, we believe that the child is doing the best that he or she can under the circumstances with the skills they have, then our role becomes different. And therefore, really understanding the nature of the child's challenge comes before we can apply any intervention. We need to actually understand what those unsolved problems are. And this aligns perfectly with our Montessori training. When we're trained as Montessori guides, we observe in our classroom daily, and we get to know our students intimately. And if a child is struggling, the first question we ask is, what is it that the child needs? What need is not being met here? And then we ask ourselves, what can I change in the environment, or what modification can I make to help this child be more successful? So this really fits beautifully with the way that we approach meeting children's needs in Montessori. So it's important to note that for the purposes of today, we're actually not going to be focusing on the behavior itself, because the challenging behavior itself, believe it or not, is actually not the problem. Its behavior is communicating to us that there is an unmet need. So to answer the question, what does this child need? We have to turn our attention and our focus away from the behavior itself and desperately wanting to make it stop, but actually try and find out what the child is communicating through this behavior. So one way to visualize this is to think about a stream, and the challenging behavior is what we're seeing downstream. But what's actually causing that behavior, the unsolved problem, is upstream, and it will continue to trigger challenging behavior until we resolve the unsolved problem at the very root. So Dr. Greene actually defines challenging behavior as behavior that occurs when demands and expectations are being placed on the child that exceed their capacity to respond adaptively. So if a child is responding maladaptively, they must not be able to meet those demands and expectations. So he describes this better than I do. Here's one more short clip from Dr. Greene.
I noticed something about 17 years ago. I noticed challenging kids aren't challenging every second of every waking hour. They're challenging sometimes, under some conditions, in some situations, under certain circumstances. I started noticing, what are those situations, conditions, circumstances? When there are demands being placed upon them for flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, problem solving. I challenge you to think of any challenging episode that you can remember that occurred outside the context of demands for flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, problem solving. And most folks have a great deal of difficulty coming up with anything. That's because that's when challenging behaviors occur. Stands to reason. If the only times challenging kids look challenging is when there are demands for flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, problem solving, logic tells me it must be because these kids are lacking those skills. You see, this is a skills deficit orientation, not a motivation deficit orientation, and that is exactly right. You do something completely different when you think a kid is lacking skills than you do when you think a kid is lacking motivation. Those are two completely different looking interventions. What do you do when you think a kid is lacking motivation? You give him the incentive to do well because you thought he didn't have the incentive to do well in the first place. But what do you do when you think a kid is lacking skills? You teach skills. This explanation makes challenging behavior in kids out to be a developmental delay, a learning disability, which it is. No different than any other developmental delay. Kids who are having difficulty reading are having difficulty mastering the skills required for being proficient in reading. Kids who are exhibiting challenging behavior are having difficulty mastering the skills required for being proficient in handling life's social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. It's a developmental delay. Here's the cool part. When you treat these kids like they've got a developmental delay, like they're lacking crucial skills, when you apply the exact same compassion as you would with any other developmental delay, I find these kids get better. No, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be fast necessarily, but they get better. Continue thinking of them as attention-seeking, manipulative, coercive, limit testing, unmotivated. I find they don't get better. I find they often get worse. Just as a kid with a reading disability would if we decided that his difficulty was due to poor motivation, attention-seeking, limit testing, coercion. This is the second pass at defining the function of a challenging behavior. According to the second pass, what is the function of a challenging behavior? Simple. It communicates to us that this kid doesn't have the skills to do it better. Because if he could, he would. All challenging behavior communicates to us is that the kid doesn't have the skills to do it better. Challenging behavior is proof positive that the kid doesn't have the skills to do it better, because let's face it, doing well is preferable to not doing well. But of course, only if you have the skills to pull it off.
I have found that reframe so helpful to me as a parent, because when my child is exhibiting behavior that I find frustrating and challenging and triggering, it enables me to be more empathetic and take it less personally, and to try and take a step back and not feel that she is attacking me or insulting me or challenging me for the fun of it, but instead to really be able to reflect and wonder what it is that is causing this behavior and gives me a focus. What can I work on? And I have found also that these umbrella skills, the need to be flexible and adaptable, tolerating frustration such as delayed gratification, a no, and the ability to solve problems. Really, it is true that most of the challenges she and I experience fall into these major categories. Not always, but very, very often. So because we now accept that kids do well as they can, our goals of intervention change. We no longer have to devise elaborate reward and punishment systems and stick with them. I know I've done lots over the years and I'm real strong in the beginning and then they fizzle out because they're just so high maintenance. Instead, we're trying to figure out what these lacking skills are and teach them. We're identifying what unsolved problems the child has that's triggering the behavior we don't like, and we work on solving them. And what I love is that in the process of moving problems from the unsolved category to the solved category, we're simultaneously teaching our child a lot of these skills that she's lacking that set the stage for this behavior in the first place. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Thank you for bearing with me as we lay the foundation for the work that we're going to do. And the second step we'll embark in is actually how you go about trying to figure out what those unsolved problems and lagging skills are. And again, I want to emphasize Dr. Greene talks about challenging kids and children with extremely challenging behavior, but this technique is extremely beneficial for all children. All children have some skills that they haven't fully developed yet and some unsolved problems. So no matter how minor, this technique will still apply, and it's just such a, you'll see when we get put it into practice. Now, this is technically a tool that Dr. Greene suggests that you use. It is on his website. It's in his workbooks. It's all free. I have the resources at the end of the presentation should you choose to use this. It's not necessary that you go through this step of the process, but it can be very beneficial if, as parents, you want to sit down together and go through this exercise. For children who are struggling a great deal with behaviors at school, this might even be something that you do in collaboration with your child's guides. This is called the ALSUP, Assessment of Lagging Skills and Unsolved Problems. And I'll show you the top and the bottom of it in just a moment. So to fill this out, you're really just checking off lagging skills that you think apply to your child and writing down unsolved problems that you'd like to address. Again, you'll want to include all the key stakeholders in the child's life. So if this is something you're doing as a family, this might be parents, or if you have a grandparent who's involved or another caregiver, you may invite them to participate. If this is in the school setting, then you'd have parents, guides, anyone who takes on a major role in the life of this child, and everyone gets their own copy. Here's what the top looks like. It's just a checklist. And these lagging skills, we check off for any that we think apply. This does not need to be unanimous. If anyone in the group thinks something applies, we check it. And this is the easiest and fastest part of filling out this form. We really only spend about 3 to 5 seconds on each check mark. We don't need to go into a great debate here. So really filling this out should only take about 2 minutes. Then the unsolved problem section of the ALSUP takes a little bit longer because we're going to write down we're going to use these prompts. They'll help get the conversation going. We're going to write down the things that we think the child is struggling with and be as specific as possible. So if the child is struggling with 30 things, this will probably take about 30 minutes to complete. And that may sound like a long time, but of course, if you recall a time when you've been doing damage control when your child is really, really upset and having a meltdown or something, I guarantee you that you've invested at least 30 minutes in managing that situation. So it's really worth it. So the conversation might go something like this. There's a prompt that says, are there specific tasks or expectations the child is having difficulty completing or getting started on? Now, this is a school example, but let's say the teacher says, yes, she gets upset and runs out of the room. Okay, we stop right there because we're describing behavior rather than the cause of it. We don't want to focus on behavior. So we're going to keep drilling. So the facilitator might ask, well, when does this happen? And the guide might say, well, during circle time. But we still don't have quite enough information. So the facilitator might ask, what's happening during circle time when she runs out of the room? And let's say the guide says, well, it's when we're singing. And then we'll rephrase for clarification. Are you telling me that Teresa's having difficulty with singing during circle time? And if the answer is yes, okay, we'll write that in. So that's just a little mini modeling of what the conversation might look like as we're filling this out. Even if you don't ever plan on filling out this form, you're going to use the technique, but you don't feel it's necessary to go through this process, I still want you to pay attention to the process of phrasing unsolved problems, because it's really important, even in just our own minds, how we phrase these problems. So instead of describing behavior, we want to use the phrase difficulty with or having difficulty. Why? The reason is we want everyone in the group to know that the behavior is not the problem. It's the expectation that the child is having difficulty meeting that's causing the behavior, and that's the problem. So, and this becomes important later, because if we keep the challenging behavior in the wording of the unsolved problem, then later when we're having this conversation with our child, we'll be throwing the behavior at them. And the child will think he's in trouble and get defensive and is far less likely to participate. And since this is collaborative problem solving, we really need the child to be receptive and wanting to participate. So the behavior's out. We, instead of saying he makes rude remarks and ignores me when I remind her to get dressed, we would take out the behavior, the rude remarks and the ignoring, and we would say difficulty with getting dressed. And of course, as specific as we can be, the better, maybe before school in the morning. We also don't want to include adult theories when we're phrasing the unsolved problem. So here's a good cue. If you hear the word because in your unsolved problem, stop right there. So instead of saying difficulty putting dirty clothes in the laundry basket because she doesn't feel like helping, we'll stop and we'll rephrase this. We'll just take out everything after the because. Difficulty with putting dirty clothes in the laundry basket. And the benefit of this is if we don't assume we know the reason for the challenging behavior, we can actually have the opportunity to ask, and we have an open mind to explore, and we're sometimes surprised. Number 3 is to split problems into specific pieces rather than clumping them together. So in this example, difficulty getting along with other children may seem like a great unsolved problem. It starts with difficulty with, but it's very general. Think of all the different ways in which children can sometimes struggle to get along. A child might have difficulty waiting patiently for a turn, or might have difficulty using words to express frustration, might have difficulty knowing how to join in a game at playtime. And so we'll want to split these out into their own distinct unsolved problems. And if that seems like a lot of work, it does create a longer list. We may find we can clump some of these up later if the root cause is all the same. But for now, we're going to split them out so that we can address them one by one. And finally, we want to be as specific as possible. So instead of phrasing our unsolved problem as difficulty sharing, we try and ask ourselves for more details, like with who, what, where, why. Who's this difficulty with? What part of it is triggering? Where is this difficult? Why, so we could phrase this difficulty if her brother plays with her toys without asking, or something like that. So we are going to practice, because this is such a challenge. It seems so simple and yet it can be challenging. So we are going to go into small little groups for about 10 minutes. And here's the example we're going to practice with. Here's the challenge the parent brings to the group. My child instigates conflict with siblings to get attention. Okay, hopefully a little red flag just went off in your head that there's an adult theory in here. Without the word because, we still have a theory that the child is doing this to try to get attention. So that's the first thing we can scratch out. Instigates conflict. I'd like to know more about that. Who, what, when, where. And we need to break this down to be more specific. So in your group, and of course this is theoretical because this is not necessarily your child, and there could be all different kinds of reasons or aspects of this, but I'd like you to practice rephrasing this as an unsolved problem that starts with difficulty with, and then brainstorm a list of 8 or 10 unsolved problems that you would write in the ALSUP if you were going through this exercise. Thanks, everyone. Well, would anyone be willing to share a couple of items off the list that your group came up with? Some of your phrases, unsolved problems, difficulty with? Feel free just to chime in.
We didn't write anything down.
I'll be willing to share that. From my perspective, yeah, I'm not reflecting necessarily the whole group. We talked about difficulty communicating needs as a probable one of the problems. But personally, I felt like this was almost like a trick question where we specifically did not have the details to understand the real what, who, when, how, and therefore be able to specifically express what the issues were.
Right. Well, that's true. For a hypothetical child in situation, you are just sort of guessing. So there were no right or wrong answers, but probably a long list of possible difficulties with. But I like the one you came up with. Any other examples?
We were kind of like making stuff up to try
Yeah.
to like define sort of the problem the way we're practicing defining the problem. So we said like something like the child has trouble sharing hair bands with her sibling.
There you go. Difficulty.
And then just like stop there because we, not explaining it or whatever.
Right.
Not like, we definitely got to cut the get attention part out, right? We don't want to try to explain it yet.
I also said just difficulty playing independently.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that could totally be going on. All right, great. Well, we thank you for going through that exercise so that we're really comfortable with phrasing unsolved problems in this way. I'll share my screen and we'll keep going and we'll get to the even more exciting part, like now what do we do with all this? All right, so when we are trying to decide what we want to address first, if we have a list of 10 or 15 unsolved problems that we want to address, we can't take them on all at once. So we'll make a plan and we'll prioritize what we want to work on first. Of course, anything having to do with safety, if you have a child who runs away and towards the street or tries to leave the house, anything that's a safety issue, we take that on first. Anything that's becoming a problem because it happens so frequently might move towards the top of the list. Or of course, anything that is, of a very serious nature, such as hurting yourself or hurting others, we want to address rather quickly. Now, I'm going to breeze through this part because you may or may not decide you want to use these tools, but on the Dr. Greene's website, he does actually have this flow chart that you can fill out if you want to put pen to paper on what are the first 3 unsolved problems you want to address and sort of track your progress through this methodology. This is it blown up a little bit bigger, just so you can see what it looks like. But let's move on, let's dig in and get to the actual intervention. And the collaborative problem solving approach we're going to be talking about, Dr. Greene refers to as Plan B, but there is actually a Plan A, a Plan B, and a Plan C. So Plan A is solving problems unilaterally. This is the parent solving the problem and just announcing, I've decided that this is how we're doing things. This is familiar and convenient to a lot of us. It's how a lot of us were raised, and it typically relies on rewards and punishments. And it does tend to work well in the short term. The problem is that Plan A actually can cause challenging behavior in children who don't have the skills to handle Plan A well. And even if it works with children who can handle having plan A imposed on them, they don't really learn anything. So this is really not where we're going to spend our time, because it can often trigger challenging behavior in children who are prone to it. Why? Because having someone else's will imposed on you requires skills to handle that well. And those are typically those umbrella skills we were talking about: difficulty with frustration tolerance, problem solving. And so when we put expectations on children who don't have the skills, we increase the likelihood of seeing maladaptive behavior. I'm skipping Plan B for a second to go over Plan C. So this involves temporarily setting aside an unsolved problem just for now. And this is not about caving in, but this is about prioritizing. So some parents balk at this point, who are concerned that Plan B involves dropping your expectations for the child. This is not the case. Expectations are a good thing. And in fact, you can't even do Plan B unless you have expectations. They just have to be realistic expectations for the child at this point in their development and the skills that they have. And because we can't tackle everything all at once, sometimes we're going to put lower priorities to the side and make a note to come back to those later. So that's Plan C. Plan B. Why do we choose Plan B? Because the child is showing us she needs help navigating problems and regulating emotions. So just like we teach skills to the child with a reading delay, and we provide physical therapy or OT for the child with a physical delay, we teach skills to a child who's having difficulty navigating problems and regulating emotions. So I'm going to let Ross Greene speak to this.
Plan B. Plan B, as you now know, is when you're doing the name of the approach, collaborative problem solving. So why are you doing Plan B? Just to be crystal clear about this, because this kid has proven to us beyond a shadow of a doubt that he needs a tour guide, somebody to serve as his tour guide for navigating problems and regulating emotions. Now, many people see tour guide and they think, wait a second, he's going to need a tour guide for the rest of his life? No, I've never seen that happen. Truth is, the minute he gets good at the skills you've been trying to teach, the minute the pile of unsolved problems that has been causing challenging behavior for Lord knows how long, once it's shrunk, you're fired. Who fired you? He did. Why did he fire you? Because kids do well if they can. And once this kid has the skills and once he knows how to solve the problems, you're fired. Have you ever heard anybody say, we're not going to give a kid reading help now because he might need reading help for the rest of his life? No, the reason you're giving the kid reading help now is so he won't need reading help for the rest of his life. Why do we apply such a completely different mentality to kids with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges? I can only think of one reason. We didn't realize that it too was a developmental delay. Now that we know that, we are freed up to treat challenging behavior in the same way that we treat other developmental delays.
All right, so there are two types of Plan B. There's one that you implement in the heat of the moment. This we could call crisis management. And much far preferable is proactive Plan B, crisis prevention. And the more we are proactive, the less we'll end up responding to challenging behavior and instead preempting it. So for purposes of today, we're focusing on proactive Plan B. Now, this consists of 3 steps, which I have actually renamed. Dr. Greene talks in one of his videos about how he didn't like the names he came up with anyway, so I took the liberty. You'll hear in his books, you'll read them defined as number 1, the empathy step. I've renamed this defining the child's difficulty. And this is what you were practicing in your breakout groups when you rephrase the unsolved problem as difficulty with. Step 2 is defining the adult's concern. So we first identify what the child is struggling with and then what the adult needs out of this situation. And then step 3, which Dr. Greene calls the invitation step, but I've renamed brainstorming, is where we actually engage in problem-solving process with our child. So let's talk about step 1 first, defining the child's difficulty. This involves gathering information from your child to understand his concern or perspective about a given unsolved problem. So even if we think we know why something is happening, we enter this step with the assumption that we have no idea. We're gathering information, and we just pluck an unsolved problem from the list that we made earlier and drop it in here. This is why it was so important that we phrased it neutrally, because when it's not neutral, it shuts down the conversation, and our goal is to start our child talking. We're looking to get to an aha moment in which we feel like for the first time we actually understand the problem. And so here we phrase this as, I've noticed that, and then here's where we just plug in an unsolved problem. We're having difficulty with teeth brushing, and we ask, what's up? Now, if you don't like what's up, that's fine. You can say, what's going on? Or, tell me more about that. But the idea is very, very neutrally to just start gathering information from our child. So Dr. Greene will give us some examples here.
The empathy step of proactive Plan B begins with a neutral observation. And these days I've been trying to be much more explicit about what words people should use. The words I usually use and encourage other people to use is, I've noticed that. And now what you're doing is you're plucking a problem from your list of unsolved problems and you're dropping it in and then finishing with what's up. Here's what it might sound like. I've noticed you haven't been too enthusiastic about taking your meds lately. What's up? I've noticed it's been really hard for you to get going on your social studies project lately. What's up? I've noticed you haven't been too enthusiastic about sitting next to Billy in circle time lately. What's up? I've noticed you haven't been too crazy about going to school lately. What's up? I've noticed whenever you and your brother play together lately, it turns into a fight. What's up? I've noticed bedtime's hard for us lately. What's up? I've noticed we've been struggling a lot about homework lately. What's up? See? You've got this list of unsolved problems. There was actually a reason that you would want to create that. You're plucking. You're saying what you've noticed. You are plucking an unsolved problem, dropping it in, and then you're saying, what's up? Now, the key to this observation is that it's neutral. Neutral is the key word. So in other words, you're not saying something along the lines of, I've noticed you're trying to ruin my life. What's up? I noticed you don't care about your homework anymore. What's up? I've noticed you don't care if you get cavities. What's up? I've noticed you don't care if you do bad in school. What's up? I've noticed you're trying to disrupt my class. What's up? Not neutral. And what's the downside to not neutral? There's a lot of downsides to not neutral, but the biggest downside to not neutral is that it's going to shut the kid up. Not neutral shuts the kid up. And the goal of the empathy step is to get the kid talking. Because if you shut him up and he's not talking, then you are not gathering information. And if you're not gathering information, then you will not know what his concern or perspective is on the problem you would very much like to be solving with him, so it doesn't cause challenging behavior anymore. Does this make sense?
Okay. So once we've defined the child's difficulty, we just use that simple formula. I've noticed that, and then you drop in the difficulty with, and you just invite the child to start speaking. So I've noticed that it's been difficult for you to brush your teeth at night. What's up? I've noticed that it's been difficult for you to stick with our 30-minute time limit on playing video games. What's up? And you start a conversation. Now, here's where there are lots of different possibilities of what can happen next, but quickly, and we won't go into breakout rooms for this because this is just an extension of what you already practiced. But we're going to practice fitting in one of those difficulties with and slipping it into our little script. I've noticed that, fill in the blank, what's up? Would someone like to substitute in one of those unsolved problems that they brainstormed in their breakout group and try sticking it in here and see what it sounds like?
I guess the one we did would work, where it's like,
Yeah.
I've noticed that you and your sister fight, or let's try to be more neutral about it, right? I've noticed that.
Like the fighting's the behavior, right?
Yeah.
How
I've
did
noticed
you difficulty with?
I've noticed that you and your sister have difficulty sharing hair ties.
There you go.
Yeah.
What's up?
What's up with that? Yeah.
Exactly. That's it.
Okay.
But you see how it takes a minute to, like, the behavior like sneaks in there, and it just takes a little practice to get the phrasing, but that's exactly it. All right, can we try it one more time? I'm trying to remember what one of the other examples was that was offered earlier. Let's say we have difficulty with bedtime. The child is resisting going to bed at night. How could we phrase this? How would we do this and define the child's difficulty? Meredith, you want to try it? I've noticed that. I'm picking on you for having your camera on. Sorry.
No worries. I guess you could say just very simply, I've noticed that you have trouble going to sleep at night. What's up?
What's up?
I've noticed that you don't want to go to bed when it's bedtime. What's up?
Yeah, I've noticed that we're having a hard time at bedtime. What's up? Exactly. Because it might not even be that she doesn't want to. We're not sure exactly why. Yeah, so as neutral as possible. I've noticed we're having a hard time going to bed. What's up? Great. Thank you, Meredith. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot. How about having a fit, or whatever that looks like, a tantrum, or being rude, or refusing when it's time to turn off the iPad or the TV. I've noticed that. Anyone want to give it a try?
I can keep going and just say, I've noticed it's hard for you to put the iPad down. What's up?
Yeah. There you go. And Nicole, you were going to try one.
I'll do the next one. I've noticed you're having a hard time doing chores. What's up?
Yeah. Great. Okay. Simple, right? All right. So thank you. We're ready to move on to the next step. Now, here are some of the possible responses, because you're not going to get, oh, mother, it's because I am frustrated about blah, 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 blah. And in fact, we'll also talk a little bit in a few minutes about toddlers and sort of less verbal children. But assuming you have a child who's able to articulate, one possible response is, I don't think that's a problem. And that's a very common response. So here we'll use reflective listening and just ask for more information. Oh, so you don't feel like that's a major concern. I don't quite understand. Can you tell me more about that? We're just going to try to keep digging as neutrally as possible. Your child might say, I don't want to talk about it. And that's understandable. Especially if this is emergency plan B, your child is not going to be able to talk about it. If they are still upset over what happened, there's no way. So you'll want to make an appointment for another time. All right, let's think about it. Let's come back to this. We'll talk about it tomorrow instead. Another possible response is that your child becomes defensive and says something like, I don't have to talk to you, or worse, and you just respond with honesty. You're right. I can't make you talk, but I'd love to hear more. And this is a process that as your child actually grows accustomed to it and gets practice with it, it gets much, much easier. They may not actually believe at first that you're genuinely interested. So the best possible response, of course, is that your child says something. This is great, but often the first thing that the child comes up with isn't actually the core of the issue. So this is when we start drilling for a little bit more information. We're not grilling them, so we don't want it to sound like the third degree, but we do want to find out more. So as we're drilling, we just keep asking ourselves, like, do I fully understand what's going on here yet? And if not, we keep asking questions. What kind of questions do we ask? We're going to do 4 of the W's, not the why, because that's harder for a child to figure out. That's pretty abstract. But we can ask who, what, when, where kinds of questions. So who are you with when this happens? Or what part of that is hard? Or when does this happen? Well, where are you when this tends to happen? And so let's see Ross Greene
Now,
practice.
Life gets interesting the minute you say, what's up? The minute you say, what's up, you're not done with the empathy step yet. You're just getting started. Because now something's going to happen. He's either going to say something or he's not going to say something. Let's talk about him not saying something for a second. He may just sit there. That's called silence. Many adults get freaked out about silence. Many adults are so ecstatic that they have now done the empathy step that silence blows them out of the water. The air just went out of their Plan B balloon, when in fact, since you never asked them about this before, the information may not exactly be on the tip of his tongue, which means you may have to be quiet. I'm working with this kindergarten kid. I actually don't know him. When I arrived to do Plan B with him, it's part of a school project that I'm working in Massachusetts, where I come in and do Plan B with a kid with his teacher so that the teacher can learn how to do Plan B. But I never met the kid, so when I come in and do this, they tell me what I'm going to be doing Plan B with him about. I was told, I'd like you to talk to him about how he has trouble keeping his hands to himself. So I said, I've heard, I couldn't say I've noticed that because I'm not his teacher. I've heard that you sometimes have trouble keeping your hands to yourself. What's up? And there we sat. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Now I'm watching carefully for the nonverbal cues. There's the nonverbal cue that says, there's the facial expression that says, I can't even remember what question you asked. It sort of looks like this. There's the nonverbal cue, I've never met you before in my life, I'm not talking to you. It looks like this. And there's the nonverbal cue, I'm thinking. That looks like this. It looked at me like he was thinking. After 30 seconds, I actually said that. I said, boy, you're really thinking, aren't you? And he went, 10 more seconds, 20 more seconds. Finally, he says, I only have trouble keeping my hands to myself when I'm with certain kids. Nice. He's talking. We're getting a little further, aren't we? What was my next question? Really? Which kids? And now I'm drilling. But before I could drill, which is what I'm about to talk about, I had to be quiet enough so the kid could talk. The other thing that people think blows Plan B out of the water is when the kid isn't silent, but instead says, I don't know. People freak over, I don't know. I don't know is honest. I'd rather actually have the kid say he doesn't know than make something up just for the sake of it. Making something up for the sake of it takes more time than I don't know. I'd rather have him say, I don't know. And all I don't know means is that we've got a little more exploring to do. Don't get freaked out over I don't know. Let's say he does say something. Your next goal is to drill, because the first thing he says is unlikely to be the total picture, which means you are now on the hook for drilling. Drilling for information. I'll give you an example of drilling, a true story. This one took place next to a teacher for security, but her doing Plan B all on her own. She just wanted me there just in case. She's sitting with a kid. Here's how it sounded. I've noticed we haven't seen much homework coming in for you lately. What's up? It's too hard. At each point along the way, what I'd like you to ask yourself is, do I yet understand? It's too hard. Do you yet understand? No. Start drilling. It's too hard. How's it too hard? It's too much. Do you yet understand? No. Keep drilling. It's too much. What part is too much? The writing part is too much. Ah, the writing part is too much. Do you yet understand? No. What about the writing part is too much? I don't know. Well, let's think about what homework you have, and then maybe we can figure out what part of it is the writing part that's too hard and too much. What type of writing assignments do you have for homework? Let's think about that. Well, I have spelling, but all I got to do is write one word. That's not it. What else do you have? Well, in social studies, all I got to do is draw a line from one word to another. That's not it. Okay. What else do you have? Science. What about science? You're making us write entire paragraphs. Yes, I am. Is that the part that's too hard and too much? Yes. Do you understand yet? Not quite, but you're getting there. You're homing in. Help me understand what it is about writing the entire paragraph for science that's so hard. You know I'm a slow writer. I start writing and I can't remember what it was that I was going to say. And then I just get all mad and I say, forget about the whole thing. Now do you understand? Good job. Well drilled. And you certainly are a whole lot further than you were when it was too hard or too much. By the way, is that a legitimate concern? Want to know what I've learned about kids, both my own two and the thousands I've worked with? Kids have legitimate concerns.
So once you think you've honed in on what the child's concern is, you've drilled down and you've got the specifics, we're going to use active listening and make sure, or reflective listening, make sure we understand the child's problem and just repeat it back. So it sounds like it's the writing part of the science assignment that feels like it's too much. Do I have that right? And then if you don't quite have it right, you just keep going. You let the child correct you and you keep drilling. There are lots of great ways you can keep a child talking with just sort of neutral statements, how so? Or what do you mean? Can you tell me more about that? Sometimes just a listening noise like, can keep a child talking. But then once we've got the child's issue on the table, it's our turn. We get to present to the child what our concern is. Now, Dr. Greene calls this defining the problem. I'm tweaking that to be defining the adult's concern, but this is where we get to communicate our concern or our perspective about the same problem. Now, some of us don't even really know what our concerns are until we reflect on a little bit. We usually have lots of ideas for solutions, but sometimes we're not actually sure what our own concern is. They tend to fall into three categories: safety issues, like learning or school issues, or how the behavior is affecting the child or other people. But once you have a handle on it, then we simply fill in the blank, my concern is, or the thing is. So for example, if the unsolved problem, we go back to difficulty with brushing teeth. So we might say to our child, the thing is, if you don't brush your teeth at night, the food you've been eating all day sits on your teeth and can cause cavities. And it's really uncomfortable to have cavities filled. Done. Okay. We've just defined our concern.
Next step, you now have the kid's concern on the table. Time for your concern. That's going to be accomplished through the define the problem step, but now you know I wish I hadn't called it the define the problem step. I called it the define the problem step because in collaborative problem solving, a problem is defined simply by two concerns that have yet to be reconciled. The kid's and yours. Why is his concern going first? Because if your concern goes first, he thinks you're doing plan A, because that's what plan A sounds like. The goal of the define the problem step is to ensure that your concern or perspective is entered into consideration, possibly beginning with more words like, the thing is, or my concern is, what's the hardest part about this ingredient? The hardest part of the empathy step, the information gathering step, is drilling. That's the hardest part of the empathy step. And going into the empathy step with an open mind, without preordained notions about what the kid's concerns are. The hardest part of the define the problem step is that adults often don't know what their concerns are. Adults often know what their solutions are. But now you know that a solution is not a concern. A concern is a concern, a solution is a solution. You're not even talking about solutions until the third ingredient of plan B. The first two ingredients of plan B are reserved exclusively for concerns. And yet, here's what so often happens. The kid puts a solution on the table and the adult fails to drill. I'm not doing that. Then the adult joins in the fray and puts a solution on the table themselves. Oh, yes, you are. We don't have two concerns on the table now. We have two solutions on the table now. We are now engaged in something called dueling solutions, also known as a power struggle. Now, power struggle is a unique type of activity. In a power struggle is a win-lose proposition. In a power struggle, you're trying to figure out who's going to win and who's going to lose. Collaborative problem solving is a win-win proposition. In collaborative problem solving, you're trying to come up with a solution that will work for both parties, that will address the concerns of both parties. But you can't possibly come up with that solution until the concerns of both parties are on the table. That, once again, is why the first two steps of Plan B are reserved for concerns, not solutions. You really don't know what problem you're trying to solve until there's two concerns on the table. Because adults have so much trouble figuring out what their concerns are, I've actually given the matter some thought. And I basically concluded that adult concerns usually can be fit into one of three categories, if you can believe it. All the things that you're concerned about could be fit into one of three categories. Here they are: safety, learning, how the behavior is affecting one's self or others. Fit. So if you're not exactly sure what your concern is, say one of those. What would our concern be on the kid who's doing no homework? Because as we have now learned, the writing part on the science is so taking him so long and is so frustrating that he ends up doing nothing. What is our concern about that? It might sound something like this. The thing is, if you don't do any writing for your homework, this is always going to be hard for you because you're never going to get any practice. Legit? Want to know what I've learned about us adults? We have legitimate concerns too. One thing you want to be wary of. Let's say you've put a lot of energy into doing the empathy step well, and you do it well, good for you. And then a lot of adults put a lot of energy into define the problem step, and they do it well, they get their concern on the table, and then what are they greeted with from the kid? I don't care. The air just went out of the Plan B balloon on that too. Many adults say, he doesn't care about my concern. Wait a second. Maybe he's well practiced at having other people not care about his. You reap what you sow. Plan A begets Plan A. Plan B begets Plan B. One thing I can tell you is that once you start caring about his concern, he'll start caring about yours.
Okay, so now we're going to practice again. We're going to start with a child's difficulty, and we're going to practice defining the adult's concern. So I heard that this was a little bit challenging to think about in the theoretical in the first round. So if you do not want to practice with one of these examples, feel free to pull one of the things you brainstormed at the beginning that is a specific challenge you are having with your child. And I'd like you to practice phrasing it as difficulty with, and then practice how you would put your concern on the table. The thing is, or my concern is. So that's what we'll be practicing, and we won't take quite as long. We'll take about 5 or 6 minutes instead of 10. But we're going to walk through this process because this is probably the most challenging part, is just getting the phrasing right. Any questions before we go into our breakout rooms? What did that feel like?
We were commiserating.
That can be very cathartic. Yeah.
It's
And that's
nice to know
important.
that like we have the same problems with like the sibling thing. Yeah.
So sometimes you just need a place to realize you're not alone. Absolutely.
In our group, it was Theory who brought up a good point that it's a lot about really understanding the problem, and that really takes precedence and will tell you what a response will be in a way. So it's really about understanding the problem of the child.
I agree. And in fact, Dr. Greene even says if you fizzle out on phase 2, like defining your concern, and phase 3, which we're about to talk about, which is brainstorming the solution, if all you do is exploring the child's issue, that's great. And he often says, like, start there. Don't try and take on the whole process at once. Just practice defining the child's concern, because it's just going to give you so much information that will then guide your intervention, whether or not you walk through this whole process. And some of you have pretty young ones at home, so they won't be able to engage in this type of dialogue with you. But by practicing that process of just trying to understand, showing empathy and asking questions, and even just the noticing, I've noticed that, what's going on? Just modeling that process is really powerful for a toddler. So by the time they get a little bit older and they do have the words, they'll already be a little bit more familiar with the technique and won't be so suspicious when you launch this new approach. So it's a great way just to start introducing the idea. And of course, you can show empathy for a young one who can't talk about it. That must be so hard. Or, I hear you. Sometimes that can be really, really helpful, is just to reflect back the experience that the child is having. So I want to make sure we don't run out of time to get to the heart of the matter. So here I am. Brainstorming. If you do have an older child and you're able to get to this step, this is part 3, where you and your child discuss and agree on a possible solution. So this is when you might say, let's think about how we can solve this problem together. Or I wonder if there's a way. And I love that framing, because you can actually insert the child's concern and your concern. So you could say, I wonder if there's a way we can make sure that you blah, 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 insert their concern, and yet I, blah, 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 insert your concern, and something that will work for both of us. Let's think about that. Last video.
Time for the third step. The third ingredient, the invitation, but I should have called it the brainstorming step. The goal of this ingredient is to brainstorm solutions together so as to address the concerns of both parties. This is very hard to do, especially for people who've only been thinking about solutions that work to address their own concerns. Coming up with solutions that address the concerns of both parties takes bravery, effort, and practice. The invitation lets the kid know this is something you're doing with him, not to him. It is crucial to let the kid know you are as invested in getting his concern addressed as you are in getting your own concern addressed. The minute he knows that, you got yourself a problem-solving partner. You got yourself a problem-solving buddy. Y'all are now the problem-solving team. This is not adversarial. This is not enemies. This is two people working together, slogging through mud, so as to come up with solutions that address the concerns of both parties on the unsolved problem that has been causing challenging behavior in this kid for a very, very long time. My attitude, worth the effort, even if you're not very good at it yet. Even if you're not very good at it yet, better than doing something that has absolutely no hope of addressing the concerns of both parties and finally getting this problem solved. I'd rather people do lousy plan B than well-executed plan A, because I know that lousy plan B is just another step on the learning curve on the way to doing well done plan B. You got to do lousy plan B before you do plan B well. So be prepared for lousy. It's in your future if you want to do plan B. It's hard. All that lousy eventually adds up to experience, and experience ultimately adds up to, you know what, I think I got this. But the first few times you do plan B, you're probably not going to be saying, I think I got this, unless you get lucky and it's seamless. I had a teacher look at me once and say, when am I going to be good at this? She said, what grade would you give me? She'd only been at this for like 3 weeks. It takes longer than 3 weeks to get good at this usually. She said, what grade would you give me? I said, I don't grade. She said, well, what grade would you give me? I said, well, I wouldn't be grading for proficiency yet. You've only been doing this for 3 weeks. Right now, I would be grading for effort and bravery. Proficiency comes later. You're not going to get to proficiency until you get a high score.
Oh, I thought we lost our audio there. So the trick, oh, this should say brainstorming. The trick to successful or solutions that have a chance of being successful are that they are realistic and mutually satisfactory. So I often find that my daughter's first attempts at offering solutions are not very realistic. So I might respond, are you sure you can do that? You know, let's make sure this is a solution we can both do. The solution is almost never, well, I'll just try harder too. They also have to be mutually satisfactory. So my daughter's solution is, I'll just have dessert first before dinner. You know, I might say, well, that's an idea. And I know that addresses your concern, but I don't think that would address my concern. Let's see if we can keep coming up with an idea that'll work for both of us. So you just keep plugging. If the child comes up with an idea that's mutually satisfactory, you agree to try that for a little while. Let the child know that you're going to meet again and discuss how it's going, because it's very rare to get it on the first try. If you and your child can't agree on a mutually satisfactory solution, that's okay, because this process takes practice. You make an appointment to talk about it at another time and keep working on it. You're still modeling the process of brainstorming and problem solving. So your child is actually learning skills through this process itself, in addition to sort of solving unsolved problems on your list along the way. Skipping this part. So some common mistakes that parents make when they're first trying are passing judgment rather than remaining neutral. It's so easy to do. So working on tone of voice and really trying to be open-minded and neutral when we're listening is really, really important. Another common mistake is not drilling down enough to truly pinpoint what the child's issue is. If we drill far enough, we'll truly have this aha moment of understanding, and then we can get to the brainstorming set. And a third common mistake is jumping in to solve the problem unilaterally, even at the end, like hearing the child's concern, putting your concern on the table, and then having the brilliant solution and imposing it yourself. So part 3 is just as important, that the child believes that you really are interested in a solution that will work for both of you. So we now have 3 steps. We have defining the child's difficulty. I've noticed that we're having difficulty at bedtime. What's up? And of course, after they talk, if you've drilled down far enough and you think you've got it, you'll try to summarize. So it sounds like, fill in the blank. Do I have that right? If you don't have it right, you keep going. If you do have it right, then you can move on to defining the adult's concern. So the thing is, and then you present your concern, just like you did in your practice group. And then you can finally move on to brainstorming, which is not just brainstorming, but hopefully choosing a strategy to try for a while. So I wonder if there's a way to meet your need and to meet my need. Do you have any ideas? And this also takes a lot of practice for the child to get to a place where they're able to offer mutually satisfactory and realistic solutions. But there's such a payoff in the end because the child is empowered. The skill extends to other areas of their life, conflicts with peers, school situations, and can really be a powerful tool for resolving conflicts within the family. One technique that a therapist shared with me is the power of having a family meeting at a regular time, maybe once a week. And so as conflicts arise throughout the week, instead of doing crisis management and trying to deal with them in the heat of the moment, you can have a little list on a clipboard or a notebook where you put these unsolved problems in. I have a friend who practices this, and whenever she's upset or something happens, she'll say, go add it to the list, and the children now know that they can do that too. I'm going to go put this on the list, Mom. We need to talk about this at our family meeting. And then that's a more neutral, calm space when you come back to it later, where the family can practice these 3 steps and really practice getting good at it. So I want to point out where all of these resources came from. If you are intrigued by this approach and would like to learn more, Dr. Greene has an amazing website called livesinthebalance.com. All of these videos, the ALSUP, the problem-solving checklist, all of these resources are free on the website there. There's a section for parents and a section for teachers. You can go into either one, but the parenting section and get lots and lots of more information. These are also the 3 books that I've read by Dr. Greene. The first, The Explosive Child, was the first he wrote about this technique. And as I mentioned, he regretted calling it that because it sort of limited his audience to only parents who had really, really, really difficult children. This is the book that made me feel so much better about my own child's behavior, and yet also was, just mind altering for me. This is my favorite. He then wrote a book called Raising Human Beings so that he would not turn off people by the title, The Explosive Child. This is an approach that can be employed with all children. So this is creating a collaborative partnership with your child. And it's virtually the same technique. So you really don't have to read both. It just depends, which you prefer. And then the third, which is not necessary for parents to read, but is something that a lot of our staff is reading, is called Lost and Found, Helping Behaviorally Challenging Students. And while you're at it, all the others, because again, this works for everybody. And part of Montessori is our curriculum is peace education. And at the elementary level, this becomes a lot of conflict resolution, and we do role playing. And even our youngest ones, learn to handle conflict by going to a peace table or a quiet area. And what Dr. Greene provides are really some tools that we can use to further enhance these skills. So what questions do you all have?
Got 2 in the chat, Margaret.
Okay. All right, let me skim down. Can you recommend any good resources about family meetings? Not off the top of my head, but I can. This is a practice that Tamara Ballas, our head of school, is a great champion of. She's talked about this in her Montessori in the Home several times. So I will ask her for her favorite article or book, and I can send that as a follow-up email. That's a great question. Will you please email attendees the presentation slides? Sure thing. Yep, happy to. And again, you'll find that all of the samples I pulled and video clips are all on the Lives in the Balance websites. But I will send an email to follow up with those links and the book titles that I just mentioned, and a resource for family meetings for anyone who'd like to learn more. What other questions?
One thing I was wondering about is it important to have some framework for what's developmentally typical in terms of the skill building or developmentally appropriate? Because I can see how this would really apply to a wide range of ages and developmental stages, but also how it might be helpful to have our expectations around some of the skill building and what kind of problem solving we're doing, and grounded in that developmental understanding.
Well, and that's where you could really use your child's guide as a resource, because of course they see children at that same age group interacting every day, all day long. And our guides are more than delighted to problem solve. And I mean, you don't have to have an ALSIP meeting, but you could email or call your guide. You don't have to wait for a parent guide conference, and just ask if you can brainstorm a little bit together or ask some of those developmental questions. In general, I'll say that even if a child is having a difficulty that they should be developmentally beyond, our intervention is the same, because we have to define what the difficulty is and then start working on building that skill set. But your child's guide is definitely going to have some great ideas about some strategies you might employ there, especially with our young ones who aren't as verbal. And again, this is something to sort of aspire to and work towards as your children get older. I think it's helpful to have the framework in mind even before they're really ready to fully participate in it. That's a great question. Any others? Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I will follow up with an email. I appreciate your time and your interest in learning a little bit more about collaborative problem solving. And if anyone does think of any questions later or finds a great resource they want to share, please do reach out to me.